The screen glowed red. Third straight quarter in the negative, the losses stacked in columns no one wanted to read aloud. Aaron Delaney stood at the head of the table, running on 4 hours of sleep and pure will. At the far end, a man in a canvas work shirt sat taking notes on a cheap pad. She had no idea who had let him in. When his pen kept moving through her presentation, something in her snapped. "We don't hire poor men," she said, cold enough to still the room. "I'm here to replace you." For a moment, no one breathed. The projector fan was the only sound, a thin whine under 12 stunned faces. Then, Roy Ellison, chairman of the Halvorsen board, cleared his throat and rose halfway from his chair, as if he could stand up fast enough to stop what had already happened. "Aaron," he said, "this is Everett Shaw. Northfield Capital brought him in. He'll be taking over as chief executive, effective at the board's confirmation." The words landed one at a time. Aaron's hand found the edge of the table and held it. She had assumed the man in the worn shirt was a facilities contractor or some junior analyst a director had dragged along to fill a seat. She had not assumed he was the reason her career was ending in a conference room 40 floors above the river, in front of the people she had spent a year trying to save. Everett didn't stand. He didn't gloat. He looked at the red screen, then at her, and his face gave nothing away. It was not the look of a man who had won something. It was the look of a man reading a wall he intended to take apart brick by brick. "Northfield holds the largest position," Ellison went on, quieter now. "After the quarter, they exercised the leadership clause. I asked Everett to see the company as it runs, not as it presents. That's why he came in unannounced. My call, not his." "Then he saw a company mid-crisis," Aaron said. Her voice was level, which cost her something. "Not a company that failed." "That's for the board to decide," Ellison said, and would not meet her eyes. Wade Ostrander sat 2 seats down, chief operating officer, 22 years at Halvorsen, hands folded like a man watching weather he had forecast. He said nothing. He only watched Everett with the patience of someone who had already run the numbers on him too. Everett spoke for the first time since the doorway. "I don't need the meeting to continue," he said. "I've seen the slides. What I need is access." He turned to Aaron directly. "Every purchase order, every vendor contract, every payment this company has approved in the last 4 years. Unredacted." Ostrander's folded hands went still. It was a small thing, half a second. Aaron, sharpened by exhaustion, was the only one in the room who caught it. "Costs are downstream," Ostrander offered, smooth as ever. "The problem is revenue." Demand softened. "That's the market, not the ledger." "Then the ledger will say so," Everett answered. "And I'll apologize for wasting your afternoon." The room emptied slowly, directors murmuring in the hall, careful not to catch Aaron's eye. She stayed until it was only the two of them and the red glow of a bad quarter neither of them had built. "You walked my floor in a work shirt to watch how people treat a nobody," she said. "You learn more that way." He gathered his pad without hurry. "You were the only person in that room who wasn't performing." That's data too. That evening, in a short-term apartment near the warehouse district, Everett unpacked 2 suitcases while a 9-year-old girl arranged her books on the windowsill in strict order of height. Sadie liked things in order. She had chosen the room facing the grain elevators because, she said, they looked like they were guarding something. "Is this a long job or a short job?" she asked. "Don't know yet." He set her nightlight on the sill and clicked it on against the coming dark. She accepted that the way she accepted most things from him completely and went back to her books. Aaron did not go home to sleep. She told herself she was reviewing continuity documents, the handover language a departing chief executive is expected to prepare. What she was actually doing, at 11 o'clock in an empty office, was typing a stranger's name into a search bar. Everett Shaw. She expected nothing, a ghost profile, a man who had bought his way onto a cap table, a name attached to money and nothing else. What came back stopped her cold. "Calumet Works," The steel components maker everyone had written off 16 years ago. 4,000 jobs circling the drain in a dead Rust Belt town, and the operator who had walked in, unglamorous and unhurried, and brought it back from the edge without gutting the floor. There was a book about it. There was a framework taught in the exact executive program she had sat through at 31. She had underlined his principles in yellow. She had built half her turnaround plan for Halverson out of his ideas without ever once knowing his face. She sat with that for a long time, the office dark around her, the river a black ribbon below. The man she had called a poor man in front of the board had written the words she had used to try to save the company. She should have felt smaller than she did. Instead, she felt a relief she hadn't felt in months, the relief of no longer being the only person in the building who could see. For a year, she had carried the whole weight of the numbers alone, arguing with directors who nodded and did nothing. Somewhere down the hall was a man who had already seen what she had seen, in a single afternoon, without being told where to look. She closed the window and did not go home. The next morning she found him already in the small conference room he had claimed, no assistant, no entourage, 4 years of printouts spread across the table in a pattern that looked like chaos and wasn't. You could have said something, in the room, when you told me who I was. He didn't look up. You'd have thought I was performing humility. People do. He slid a page toward the empty chair. Sit. You know this company better than anyone on that board. I'd rather have you across the table than under it. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was recognition, which, to a person dismissed for a year, was almost harder to take. She sat. Across the table, he had built something out of the printouts, not a slide, not a story, just an arrangement of facts waiting for a person who could read them. He pushed the nearest stack a few inches toward her, an invitation with no speech attached, and went back to his own. For a while, neither of them spoke. He didn't fill the quiet with reassurance the way the consultants always had. He slid pages across when he wanted her to see them and pulled them back when he was done. It was the least performed hour she had spent in that building in a year. Then he saw it. The pattern she had flagged to her own directors and been told she was imagining the slow, quiet erosion in cost of goods that matched no market she knew. He circled it without prompting, tapped it twice, and looked up. You've seen this. For a year. They said I didn't understand manufacturing, that I was reading noise. It isn't noise. He wrote a single word on his pad and turned it toward her, like a name pulled out of dark water. Granite sourcing. By the second day, the disagreement between them had a clear shape. Aaron wanted to freeze hiring, defer maintenance, idle the third production line, sell anything that would put a green number in front of the board before it voted her out for good. That's triage, Everett said. You stop the bleeding, you never ask why the patient is bleeding. I don't have the runway to be philosophical. She paced the narrow room. You have a mandate to replace me. I have maybe 3 weeks to prove a year of my life meant something, and you want to spend it reading purchase orders. I want to spend it reading the right purchase orders. He unrolled 4 years of margin data across the table in a single long ribbon of paper, weighting the ends with 2 coffee mugs. Your revenue is flat, not falling. Ostrander's right about the market and wrong about the cause. Your top line holds steady. Your gross margin walks off a cliff, slow, even, deliberate, like someone opened a small valve 4 years ago and left it running. Aaron came around to his side and followed his finger down the line. She had lived inside these numbers for a year and never once seen them laid out flat, end to end, where the shape was undeniable. That's not incompetence, she said slowly. No. Incompetence is loud and uneven. It panics, it overcorrects, it leaves fingerprints. He tapped the smooth curve. This is patient. This is a hand on the tap, turning it a 1/4 inch at a time, for years. Aaron straightened. She had come in that morning planning to fight him to defend the cuts, the plan, the year of work he'd been sent to erase. Instead, she was standing at his shoulder looking at the same line, and for the first time in a long time the enemy in her head had a shape that wasn't her own reflection. For a year she had fought the numbers as if they were an accusation aimed at her. He had turned them, in a single afternoon, into a question aimed at someone else, and questions, unlike verdicts, could be answered. The door opened without a knock. Ostrander came in with 2 directors and the easy authority of a man who owned the hallway. "I hear we're chasing ghosts in accounts payable," he said, pleasant, expansive. He picked up the granite page, glanced at it, set it down like a thing already handled. Granite sourcing. Specialty castings, single source. We consolidated suppliers years ago to protect the line when the old vendor folded. I approved that contract myself. It kept the plant running. He turned to Aaron, the warmth thinning a degree. And, frankly, that consolidation happened on this CEO's watch. If margin slipped afterward, we might start closer to home before we start inventing conspiracies. It was a clean move. He had taken the one thread that led to him and looped it, gently, around her neck. Aaron felt the room begin to tilt toward the old story, the outsider CEO in over her head. She was so tired of that story she could have laughed. Everett said nothing while Ostrander spoke. He waited until the door closed, then looked at her. "He answered a question I didn't ask. He does that." She hesitated, then crossed to the credenza, unlocked the bottom drawer, and took out a folder she had told no one existed. Her own notes. A year of them, dates, invoice numbers, questions she had asked and answers that never came. "I kept this in case they fired me. So there'd be a record that I saw it, that I wasn't asleep at the wheel." Everett read the first page, then the second, slower. "You weren't imagining it. I know. I mean," he said, and looked up. "I believe you." They worked past midnight 3 nights running. She stopped pretending she was reviewing continuity documents. He stopped pretending this was only a job he'd been talked into. She learned the way he worked, no theatrics, no war room speeches, just the same unhurried attention turned on one problem until it gave. She started to understand why a dying steel town had trusted a stranger in a work shirt with everything it had left. "Why this company?" she asked one night, both of them ringed by cold coffee and paper. "You could pick any turnaround in the country. You picked a mid-cap parts maker in Minnesota that's about to be a headline." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Somebody I trusted asked me. And it's a company that makes real things, with real people on the floor. Presses, castings, shifts that start at 6. He rolled his shoulders. "I spent a lot of years believing that mattered. I'd like to believe it again." She didn't push. She was learning the shape of his silences, the way certain subjects had a low fence around them close enough to see over, too polite to climb. "You never ask me the same thing back," she said after a while. "Why I fight this hard for a company that isn't mine. No family name on the building, no shares worth keeping." She turned her pen over in her fingers. "My father ran a hardware store for 30 years. Watched a chain move in across the road and price him out in 18 months, and nobody in any boardroom lost a single night of sleep over it. When I took this job, everyone said it was a stepping stone. It never was. I wanted, one time, to be the person in the room who didn't let it happen to the people downstairs." She shrugged, almost embarrassed. Turns out the person doing it was 3 chairs down the whole time. He didn't answer right away. He only looked at her a beat longer than a colleague would, and filed it somewhere. The way she was learning, he filed the things that mattered. A little after 11, the building manager called. A pipe in the unit above had let go. Water was coming through the ceiling of their short-term apartment, and he needed them out while it was fixed. Everett couldn't leave the case, so Sadie came to the office instead, in pajamas and a coat, carrying her height-ordered books in a canvas bag. Erin, who had spent the year cast as the villain of her own building, found herself clearing a corner of the big table, digging crackers from a drawer, and drawing a map of the grain elevators on the back of a spreadsheet because the girl wanted to know what they guarded. "My mom used to draw," Sadie said, matter of fact, coloring the elevators a careful gray. Dad keeps the ones she did in a box. Sometimes we look at them. Aaron glanced at Everett. He was watching his daughter with a stillness that had nothing to do with the ledger. Her name was Meredith, he said, so quietly it was almost not to Aaron at all. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Aaron looked back down and kept coloring beside the girl, and the fence around that subject stayed exactly where he had built it, and she left it standing. Sadie narrated as she worked which elevator was tallest, which one she'd decided was in charge. Aaron answered every question as if it were the most important business of the night, and forgot, for whole minutes at a time, that a board was deciding her future 40 floors up. It was nearly 1 when Sadie fell asleep across 2 chairs under Everett's coat. Neither of them said anything about the hour. Neither of them left. Ostrander did not wait to be cornered. He went where power actually lived, the space between board members, in phone calls that left no minutes and no fingerprints. By week's end, the story had grown legs. Aaron heard it first from a director she'd once trusted, delivered as a favor. The new chief executive was compromised. He'd gone soft on the failed CEO, protecting her instead of cleaning house, and now the two of them were rifling through old paperwork to build a case against a loyal operator who'd given the company 2 decades. Northfield had sent a fixer. The whisper went, and the fixer had been captured in a single week. "He's slowing your audit," Aaron told Everett. "Every request you send to accounts payable, something gets escalated. Something needs legal review. It's never no. It's later, and later runs out my clock and yours. I know what later is." Everett had run out of patience with almost nothing in his life. This was the exception. He isn't defending a decision. He's buying time. Men like him always are. Aaron had spent a year believing the slowness was her own doing, that if she were sharper, more senior, more something, the answers would have come faster. Hearing him name it a tactic instead of a failure, she felt the last of that particular shame burn off. It wasn't her. It had never been her. For the first time, they stood together in front of a Director Ellison's swing vote, a cautious man named Pruitt, who had been leaning toward Ostrander's version. Aaron walked him through the margin curve without raising her voice. Everett walked him through what a single-source specialty vendor should cost and what Granite actually charged, quarter over quarter. They didn't accuse anyone. They only made the man look at the shape of it. "If I'm wrong," Everett said, "an independent audit clears every name in a week, and I'll say so to this board with my signature on it. If I'm right, waiting costs the company more every single day. Either way, the honest answer is the same." Look, Pruitt left without committing. But he left thinking, which was more than they'd had that morning. It was not a win. In a fight against a man who dealt only in later, it was something rarer, a crack of daylight, and a reason to keep the door open one more day. At the edge of all this, unnoticed, was a gray-haired woman named Ada Kowalski, who had run accounts payable at Halvorsen for 26 years. She stood near the copier while Everett's requests were quietly buried under review flags, and said nothing, and her jaw set in a way no one bothered to read. She had a pension 18 months out. She had a folder in a drawer at home. She had been overruled once, years ago, by a man who signed his own approvals, and she had never quite stopped being afraid of him. That evening, after the floor emptied, Ostrander stopped by her desk. He was warm. He was always warmest when it mattered most. "Ada." The Granite files. Some of that older documentation is a mess: duplicate scans, superseded terms, versions on top of versions. Legal wants it cleaned up before an audit wastes a week chasing noise. "Purge the redundant copies. 48 hours. He smiled. "You've always kept the tidiest shop in the building." She said she would. She sat alone at her desk long after he'd gone, the building ticking as it cooled, and looked at the drawer where she kept a thing she was not supposed to have. Ada Kowalski came to the small conference room at 7 in the morning, before the floor filled, because she had decided somewhere in the dark that she would rather lose the pension than lose the last pieces of herself she'd traded to keep it. She set a worn accordion folder on the table without a word and stepped back, hands folded, like a woman waiting to be scolded. 3 years ago I flagged the granite invoices, she said. The unit prices didn't make sense. Castings we could buy at market for a third of the price. I sent it up. Mr. Ostrander told me I'd misread the terms and moved vendor reviews off my desk that same afternoon. I made copies before the files left. She paused. I don't fully know why. Maybe because being told you're wrong when you're right does something to a person. It stays. Everett opened the folder slowly. Aaron came around the table to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and the two of them read it the way you read a diagnosis you'd already half suspected. It was all there. In the flat gray language of purchase orders, Granite Sourcing had no plant, no employees on record, a registered address that traced to a mail drop in a strip mall. It bought commodity castings on the open market and resold them to Halverson at a markup that climbed, quarter over quarter, for 3 straight years. Every payment above the review threshold carried one approval signature. The same signature. Ostrander's own hand, self-authorized, on a supplier he controlled through 2 thin layers of shell companies. The margin cliff had a name now. It was not a market. It was not a soft quarter. It was a valve, and a hand on the valve, exactly as Everett had said on the second day. For a moment neither of them spoke. The thing they'd been chasing for 2 weeks had a face now, and it was a face they passed in the hallway every day, the same easy smile, the same folded hands. He didn't just steal, Aaron said, very quiet. He built a failure. He needed the numbers to look like me. Depressed valuation, Everett said, following it to the end. A CEO the board blames and removes. A quiet buyer waiting to take the company cheap once you're gone and he's the last man standing to run it for them. He closed the folder. You weren't in, over your head. You were the cover story. You were doing your job well enough that it took him years to bury you. For a year, Erin had carried a private fear she'd never said aloud that maybe she really had failed, that all her fight had been the flailing of someone who never belonged in the chair. She stood in the gray morning light and felt that fear let go of her, finger by finger. I need you to hear this from me, Everett said. He turned to face her fully, and there was no ledger left in his voice. I read your numbers before I ever met you. I never once thought you were the problem. I came in ready to replace a CEO who'd run a company into the ground. That's not who I found on this floor. Aaron held his gaze. Whatever she wanted to say was too large for a Tuesday morning, so she said none of it. She laid her hand briefly over the folder over 3 years of a quiet woman's courage and left it there, and let the silence do the work the words couldn't. Thank you, she said to Ada, and meant it in a way that made the older woman look at the floor. They built the case the way it had to be built cleanly, so no one could ever call it a coup. Everett refused to move against Ostrander through the hallways the man owned. Instead, they routed everything through the channels that couldn't be whispered away. A formal engagement of an independent forensic auditor, retained directly by the board's audit committee, with Ada's documentation logged, preserved, and time-stamped, and Ostrander walled off from the review. He'll see it coming, Aaron said. Let him. Everett didn't look up from the engagement letter. A man who owns the shortcuts can't stop the front door. I've done this before. You don't beat someone like Ostrander by being clever, he can match. You beat him by being boring, and correct, and impossible to interrupt. It was, Aaron thought, the same principle that had saved Calumet, the refusal to be rushed, the willingness to be underestimated right up until the moment it stopped being an advantage for the other man. It took 11 days. 11 days of Ostrander testing the walls, a legal objection here, a sympathetic director there, a rumor that Everett's own record wasn't as clean as the book about Calumet had claimed. Each time, Everett absorbed the hit and stayed on the paper. Each time, Aaron watched him decline to take the bait, and understood a little more about the man who'd saved a steel town, not with a speech, but with patience that never once cracked. In the middle of it, in a corridor outside the executive floor, a director tried to corner Erin alone to press her on some irregularity in her first-year expense filings, an old smear in new clothes. Everett stepped in without a word, put himself between them, and turned the whole thing into a scheduling matter so smoothly the director never realized he'd been blocked. He didn't announce it. He didn't glance at Erin for credit. He simply built the wall she needed and moved on down the hall. She noticed. She noticed everything now. That night, over the endless paper, she asked him again the real question this time, the one under the one he'd answered. Somebody you trusted asked you. That's the part you gave me. What's the part you kept? He was quiet a long moment. Then, because it was late, and because she'd earned it. Meredith's father worked this floor. 34 years on the Halverson line. Carl. He put 3 kids through school running a press 2 levels down from where we're sitting, and he thought this place was worth being loyal to right up to the end. He turned a page he wasn't reading. When Northfield said the name of the company, I couldn't say no. Saving it is the closest thing I have left to keeping a promise to a man who's gone. I never told him I'd try. He never asked. You end up owing them the things you didn't get to say. Erin said nothing. She reached over and stilled his hand on the page, once, and let go before it could become more than it was. Later, Sadie was there again, the apartment repairs still dragging asleep for real this time, in a nest of coats in the corner. Erin found a blanket in the wellness room and laid it over the girl, and when she straightened, Everett was watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for and didn't try to name. She likes you, he said. She has good taste. And for 1 second, in a building that had spent a year treating her as a problem to be solved, Erin let herself feel at home inside it. Ostrander made his last move the only way a cornered man with real power can. He tried to end the fight before there could be a verdict. He went to Northfield directly, over Everett's head, and framed the independent audit as a rogue operation. A captured chief executive, a discredited former CEO, a loyal career operator being railroaded to cover their shared failure. He argued the audit itself was destabilizing the company at the worst possible moment, spooking lenders, risking the very jobs it claimed to protect. Then he did the one thing his title still let him do. He couldn't fire an auditor the board's committee had hired, so he starved it instead, choking off the forensic team's access to company systems and records under a pending governance review hold. The evidence Ada had preserved sat safely outside his reach, but a review that can't see the ledger can't finish. And an unfinished review is one a nervous board can be talked into shelving. For a day and a half, it worked. The auditor's access went dark. Everett's mandate, still unconfirmed by a final board vote, hung by a single thread that Ostrander was patiently cutting from the inside. He's not trying to win the audit, Erin said, pacing. He's trying to make you resign before there is one. If you walk now, the story writes itself. The fixer, who got captured, cleaning out his desk on the way out. And I go down with you. There's no version where I survive your exit. I'm not walking. You might not get the choice. She stopped. They can decline to confirm you. Northfield spooked. Spooking people is the only real skill he has, and he's spent 20 years getting good at it. Everett looked at her across the wreckage of paper, and for once let her see the tiredness under the patience. I disappeared once. After Meredith, I told myself I was done fighting for things that break, that it was easier to build a small shop where nothing has stakes and nothing can be lost twice. He almost smiled. You made that harder. I'd nearly gotten comfortable. So did you, she said. It was the closest either of them had come to saying the other thing, and they both let it stand where it was, unfinished, because finishing it would have cost more than either could spend that night. The wall between them had been coming down for 2 weeks, one silence at a time. Neither of them stepped through it now. Both stood at the gap and knew, without a word, that it was there. The break came from the one person no one at the top had thought to account for. Ada Kowalski, pension 18 months out, fear 30 years deep, called Ellison directly. She had never spoken to a board chairman in her life. She told him, in her flat, careful voice, that she would testify, in person, under her own name, that she'd been ordered to destroy documents 48 hours ahead of an audit and had kept them instead, and was done being afraid of a signature. What Ostrander had never understood about people like Ada was that fear, kept long enough, curdles into something harder. She had spent 3 years watching a man teach her that being right was a liability. She had decided, alone at her kitchen table the night before, that she would rather hand back the pension than hand him one more day of her silence. An order to purge records ahead of an audit is not a governance dispute, it is a crime. Ellison, who'd spent his whole career avoiding exactly this kind of morning, finally understood what he was sitting on. The special session was called for Thursday. One outcome or the other. No middle left to hide in. The boardroom was full when Everett walked in, no work shirt this time, but no armor either. Just the man, a single accordion folder, and a woman from accounts payable seated quietly along the wall. He didn't perform. He laid it out exactly the way he'd promised weeks earlier. Boring, correct, impossible to interrupt. The independent auditor's preliminary findings, the granite sourcing shell, traced through its 2 layers to the man at the table. 3 years of self-authorized approvals in one recurring signature. A markup curve that mapped, line for line, onto the margin cliff the board had spent a year blaming on the woman standing at the far end of the room. Then, Ada Kowalski spoke, hands folded, and told 12 powerful people the small, true thing she'd been ordered to destroy, and why she hadn't. Ostrander reached, once, for the hallway that had always saved him. There was no hallway inside the room. He tried anyway, with words the market, the consolidation, the CEO's inexperience, the same 3 notes he'd played for a year. But the notes needed a hallway to travel down. They needed a phone call after the meeting, a favor, a later. In a room with the door shut and the numbers already on the table, they were just sounds. One by one, the directors who'd carried his version for a year stopped meeting his eyes and started reading the folder in front of them instead. By the time the chairman moved toward a vote, there was nothing left to decide that the paper hadn't already decided for them. When it was done, Ellison asked Everett the question the whole session had been bending toward. The leadership clause was his. Northfield's mandate was his. The chair was, by every right in the bylaws, his to take. "You came in to replace the chief executive," Ellison said. "The floor is yours." Everett stood. He looked, for a long moment, at Erin, the woman he'd been sent to remove, who'd kept a folder in a locked drawer for a year in case they fired her before she could prove she'd seen the truth. "I came to replace a CEO who failed this company," he said. "I've spent 3 weeks reading everything it does, down to the shift logs. I never found that CEO. What I found was a chief executive who saw the fraud before anyone would listen, and fought it alone, and was very nearly buried for it." He set his folder down, unopened. "The thing this board needs to replace is sitting 3 chairs to my left, not the woman at the end of the table. My recommendation is that Erin Delaney remain your chief executive. I'll stay only long enough to see the audit through. Then, I'd like to go home." The vote wasn't close. Ostrander was suspended within the hour. The matter referred to the authorities where it belonged. He gathered nothing. There was nothing left on the table that wasn't now evidence. He walked out the way men like him always do, upright, unhurried, already rehearsing the version where he was the one wronged. No one held the door. It was almost anticlimactic, in the end. That was the thing Everett had learned in the steel town and never unlearned. The truth, laid down flat and left alone, doesn't need to raise its voice. It only needs a room that can no longer look away. And Erin Delaney, who 3 weeks earlier had stood in this same room, believing her career was ending, stood in it now with her name cleared and her company still standing, and did not sit down. The forensic work took months. The shell unwound, layer by patient layer. The quiet buyer who'd been waiting for the company to fall found nothing worth the wait and moved on to easier prey. The stolen margin, recovered where it could be, went back into the third production line and the jobs that ran it, and the plant Carl had given 34 years of his life to kept its doors open through the winter. Ada Kowalski kept her pension after all. The board, on Everett's quiet insistence, made sure of it, and made sure her name went into the record as the reason any of it had been caught. She went back to her tidy shop in accounts payable and, for the first time in 3 years, approved nothing she didn't believe. Everett stayed until the audit closed, then did exactly what he'd said. He drove home to Faribault, to the shop where nothing had stakes, and rolled up the door on a cold, bright morning, and did not, in fact, disappear. Because Sadie had asked, in the flat way, she asked the important things, whether they'd ever see Aaron again, and because a company an hour up the highway had a chief executive who kept finding reasons, real ones, a supplier question, a process her own turnaround had borrowed from a framework she'd underlined in yellow at 31 to drive south on a Saturday. The first time, they said it was about the audit. The second time, neither of them bothered to say anything at all. Spring came late that year, the way it does that far north. The truck learned the route south without being told. Sadie started leaving a book at the shop on purpose, so there'd be a reason to come back for it, though no one ever pointed that out to her. Faribault is a small town, and small towns notice a CEO's car in a mechanic's lot on a Saturday. Everett let them notice. He had spent 3 years being invisible on purpose, and he found, somewhere in that first winter, that he no longer had the appetite for it. Aaron came to know the shop, the smell of cut metal and old coffee, the girl who arranged her books by height and had, at some point, started saving a chair at the workbench without mentioning it. Sadie set a place for 3 now at the little table in back, without being asked, and Everett never corrected the count. She learned the fence Everett kept around certain subjects, and learned, slowly, which sections of it he was quietly taking down, board by board, when he thought she wasn't watching. He learned, for his part, that a woman who'd fought a full year alone didn't need to be rescued, only stood beside, only believed on the mornings it was hard to believe herself. There were no declarations. There was a chair that stayed saved, and a fence coming down one board at a time, and a girl who'd decided something about a woman long before the adults got around to deciding it for themselves. But on an afternoon at the end of that first winter, Sadie ran ahead across the frozen lot toward the truck, and Aaron reached for Everett's hand without deciding to, and he let her, and the reaching said everything the two of them never would. He had come to replace her. In the end, the only thing he replaced was the empty space each of them had gotten far too used to living around.